I am going to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing at Simple, um, and hopefully leave you guys with some sort of food for thought. How many folks here are familiar with Simple? Oh wow, any customers here? All right, cool. So for those of you who don't know much about Simple, let me just give you a little bit of background. Right, so Simple replaces your bank with a smarter way to save and spend. And when you sign up for Simple, you get this card in the mail. Um, and this card is attached to an interest-bearing checking account that's FDIC insured by our bank partner. And what's different about Simple is when you swipe your card, we automatically categorize all of your transactions in real time, so you don't have to do any sort of budgeting. We also have some tools that allow you to set aside money for things like your cell phone bill or your rent or your groceries. And we show you this number we call safe to spend, which tells you how much money you can safely spend today without hurting yourself tomorrow, right? And we spend a lot of time thinking about customer experience. We try to do things different. We try to make every interaction with Simple delightful. And so when you sign up for Simple, you get this in the mail. It's normally when you get a new card from a financial institution, it comes in that number 10 envelope. It's that white number 10 envelope. You open it up, and your card is like attached to that white piece of paper with a little bit of gummy glue. And that's like the best thing because you like take it out and you get to like play with it. But the rest of the experience is horrific. So we wanted to do things differently, and you get this card carrier in the mail, and it actually snaps in two, and it becomes this sort of minimal wallet where the card's on one side and your cash is on the other side. So we operate in the banking and payments industry, which is really, really complicated. It's actually quite a mess. And in order for us to provide the customer experience that we want to provide, we actually have to rip out a lot of the sort of technology that was there before us. It's all this sort of cruft and legacy stuff that we have to rip out. So we take off a whole bunch of rubber bands to get at the data that we need to build a customer experience that we want to offer. And the reason why we do this is because every single year there are three things that top the New Year's resolutions list. One, people want to save more, they want to spend less, and they want to pay off debt. And the big challenge, specifically in this country, is that banks fundamentally make money by keeping customers confused, right? And I'm not trying to be overly controversial about this, maybe a little bit, but when the bank's incentives are to make money from an overdraft fee, and banks actually make more than 50% of their revenues from fees and charges, then their interests aren't necessarily aligned with yours. And so when it comes time to get good advice, or when it gets time to have clean interfaces that allow you to really understand how much money you have, if the bank's incentive is to charge you that overdraft fee, there's a mismatch of incentives, right? So even if you go outside of your bank to try and find a budgeting tool, like a Mint, for example, it's not the best experience either, right? Because there are a few reasons for this, right? The first is that they rely on third-party data sources because they don't actually have access to the underlying data. They get it from aggregators that only provide 3 fields of data for every transaction that you make. Normally, they'll get sort of the merchant name, the date of the transaction, and the amount, right? And with that, they then have to figure out, well, how do I categorize this transaction? Was this a restaurant? Was this a pharmacy transaction? All of the merchant names typically have lots and lots of sort of junk that gets sent out over the wire, and they have to figure out whether or not it was actually like the coffee shop next door, or it was a Target, and there's usually lots of junk and hash marks in all the merchant name descriptions. And so it's not really their fault, but that's the data that they get, and that's how they present it to you. And that means that you have to go back all through your transactions and recategorize them. And if you've ever used these kinds of tools, that's, you're familiar with that. The other thing is that they're not real time. And so when you're out there swiping or you're making payments, or you might have like a rent payment that's coming up the next day, these tools aren't really good at showing you how much money you actually have. So if you're going into a store and you're trying to figure out, well, do I actually have money to spend on this item? You don't really know because it's not real time. And then sort of lastly, they don't really solve that underlying problem of bank incentives, right? Because they're running on top of that bank experience. So how did things get so screwed up, right? If you look at the payments networks, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of different layers. And at the sort of core of it, there are some really old payments technologies that have been working very, very well, and they don't break, but they're not exactly the most innovative things, right? So when you strip everything down to the actual metal, money only moves in this country in 3 ways, right? It's not like PayPal or Dwal or all these other innovative services. There are 3 of them. 2 of them are operated by the Federal Reserve. The first is something called FedWire, which is a real-time gross settlement service. It's typically used for large dollar amounts, and it's gross. So if I send $100 to you and you send me 120, that full amount gets processed, right? And there are a few thousand banks that are members of FedWire, so it's a bank-to-bank network. Then there's the National Settlement Service. The National Settlement Service is also run by the Federal Reserve. It's a net settlement service, so if I owe you 100 and you owe me 120, then only the $20 gets settled, right? This is batch-based, so they wait for essentially a period of time before they process all the transactions. And so it's not real time, and it's also for larger dollar settlements. Typically, credit card transactions, ATMs, all that stuff is settled by NSS. And then lastly is chips, and if you grew up during the 80s, it's the most stylish and exciting payments network. It's actually the clearinghouse interbank payments service system. And this one is actually a private network. It's not the Federal Reserve, and it's owned and operated by the banks, right? Now the problem with all of these services is that while they work really, really well, they weren't architected to support millions and millions of transactions that are going in between individuals, right? And for the most part, they're not real time. So most of the banks that have built technology on top of these networks, because the underlying networks were in real time, they weren't really thinking about real time either. And real time actually wasn't much of a big deal until mobile devices came around, where you could just pull it out of your pocket and check your balance and see how much money you have and transact. But now that is something that we all want to do, we're really handicapped by the old technology that underlies the systems, right? And so if you think about your bank experience today, and even sort of earlier, just a few years ago, you would walk into the branch, and convenience was really being able to talk to a teller to get your questions answered. And it wasn't so much of a problem back then because it was a teller-mediated experience. You had the teller that you could talk to, and the teller could help you, and they could sort of interpret what you needed by going deep into the belly of the core systems that the bank offered. That became more and more difficult as banks actually merged. There's a huge wave of deregulation, and a lot of banks merged together. Now you have just a few really large banks, then about 7,000 smaller banks right now. But because of that merger wave, a lot of these technologies had to get integrated. And it wasn't a really difficult thing to have 2 screens in front of the teller showing one customer from this bank and another customer from another bank, because they were able to mediate that. But when the internet came around, they had to really integrate those systems and sort of expose this crufty old legacy data directly to the customer. So the customer is just looking at all the nastiness that was the product of all of these mergers and lots of old technologies. And so they had basically built a boat, but now the boat that the banks built was required to fly, and that's really, really hard. This is a quote that Evan Williams, this is something that he said at the XOXO conference in Portland a few weeks ago. He said, "The internet is a giant machine designed to give people what they want." And it really resonated with me because when you're thinking about banking, the online banking world is really not designed with that in mind right now. I mean, if people want to save more, spend less, and pay off their debts, they really don't have the tools that they need today. This is something that gets sent to you every single month, right? This is just complete insanity to me. Maybe you guys are way more financially responsible than me, but I've never balanced my checkbook. But I get, you get this every month. But this just drove me insane. The first thing that they say is note, right? Note. Ensure your checkbook register is up to date with all transactions. Okay, got that. Remember, this is being sent out to millions of people every month. There's an extra space here between additions and not. And it's just so careless, and they can't even get this column of your dollars to like line up. And then they give you, okay, list, add step 2 to it. It's like, all right, it's like filling out an IRS form, right? And why does it have to be this hard, right? Like, we have computers that are really good at adding and subtracting and that kind of thing. So when we're thinking at Simple, like, how do we actually improve this experience? We want to start with the customer. What does the customer want? What is their ideal experience? Or at least, what are their pain points so that we can come up with the experience that we know will satisfy their needs, right? And once you kind of figure that out, then it's the question is like, well, what is the data that we need so that we can build that experience for the customer? And what is the required architecture so that we can get that data out, right? And like I was saying in the opening, like, we had to just rip out a whole bunch of stuff. And when you rip out a bunch of stuff, you get to like the underlying things that are exciting and like give you the data that you need to build something really cool, right? So here, this is just a screenshot of our web experience. And we built this with data that we're getting directly from our processor. So we get what's called the ISO 8583 standard feed, which gives us about 30 different fields versus those 3 fields that some other folks get. And so with that, we get the merchant name, the timestamp, the merchant classification code, which shows like whether it was a restaurant or whatnot. And that's problematic too, so we have to clean that. And there's a lot of machine learning that we do to make that clean. We geocode all the transactions by adding more data onto the data that we're getting across the wire. But ultimately, this is just about that experience, right? So we want to make sure that customers can engage with their finances and get immediate answers to questions without having to pull out like an Excel spreadsheet or spending hours and hours a day with Quicken, right? So here we have a search feature, and it actually works. Like, you can search for your transactions, and it actually returns useful information. And we store all of customers' transaction data because storage is really cheap. Everything lives in the cloud, and banks in the 80s never thought of doing this because it was just so expensive to store stuff. So I'm going to search for something. I'll search for dinners, all right? So dinners. How do we know it's dinner? Well, because we're getting all this great data, we know the timestamp. We know whether it was a restaurant or fast food or whatnot. And so if it was between the hours of, say, 4:30 and 2 a.m., well, it was probably dinner, right? So you can search, and we'll tell you exactly how much money you've spent on dinners, right? And if you want to see it on a chart, we'll show it to you, and you can see what your spending patterns look like over time. And maybe you're spending too much at McDonald's, or maybe whatever you want to do to sort of change your behavior. We're giving you the data that will inform your decision making. So you can make those trade-offs and understand what those trade-offs look like. And then you can get even fancier. You can say, well, how much did I spend on dinner this year? Right? So we understand the natural language search, and we'll show you we'll show you what your spending looks like over that past year. Money Drop is another feature that we recently announced. It's not yet available, but it allows you to essentially transfer money to a friend who's in proximity. It feels a lot like cash. All you do is you take your thumb, you transfer the money from your face to your friend's face, and you just drop money on their face. And it is like just the most fun you'll ever have paying someone back. That's really what I wanted to share with you today about Simple. I would just say, if you're looking at an industry that's really, really complicated, that is where the opportunity lies. Healthcare, finance, banking, I mean, these are really complex industries, and they're just screaming out for help. So if I could leave you with one thing, is seek out that complexity and simplify it. So thank you.